The next topic we're going to deal with is binding properties. In JavaFX, there's this thing called a binding property that enables us to associate together target objects and source objects so that the target object will be bound to the source object. By that, what we mean is if the value in the source object is modified, the target property will also change automatically, and it may not necessarily match it, but it will at least change with it in some way. We'll show an example of that to help clarify this in a moment. The target object is then called a binding object or a binding property, and the source object is then called a bindable object or an observable object. So let's think now about that last demo where the circle stayed at the coordinates we had specified for it, and when the window size changed, it did not go for the ride. It didn't change, it just stayed where it was. If we wanted to modify that behavior so that somehow as you resize the window, the circle center would change its position, we would need to use this binding property that was introduced on the previous slide. Instead of using the set center x method that we used with a circle before to determine the x value of where it was going to be centered, we're rather going to use a different method called center x property, because this is a property and therefore it can be bound to another property, particularly the size of the window. So the pane that we put the circle in has dimensions that are dependent on the size of the stage, that is the window. So when we resize the window, we resize the stage, and in turn we resize the pane. The pane then has properties that can be examined. And if you take a look at the code here, where you can find the line circle.centerXProperty.bind, we're binding it using the bind method to a property that goes with the pane, namely the width property. So we're binding it to pane.widthProperty, but we're not binding it directly. We're taking that width property and dividing it by 2. Now that's what we did with the fixed size window in the initial demo. We made the window or the pane 200 by 200, and we put the circle at coordinates that were 1/2 of each of those values, namely at 100, 100. In other words, 200 divided by 2 for the x, 200 divided by 2 for the y. So we didn't want the value to match the size of the window, but rather we wanted it to be the window size divided by 2. Now we can't just put /2 in there because that won't work in the context of these objects. The slash only works with primitives. So we have to use a divide method. So we say dot divide 2 to get that to happen. The difference between what's happening here and what happened in the previous demo is that we set the x and the y coordinates for the center of the circle to static values that did not change. We set them to 100 and they stayed there no matter what happened to the window. But now when we do it this way, there's a binding between the property representing the width and the height of the window and the properties representing the center of the x and y coordinates for the circle. And dynamically, as we resize the window when the application is running, this will continuously update the center x property and the center y property of the circle so that it always stays in the center of the window. We'll now go out to the Eclipse IDE and give this demonstration a try.